Welcome back, students. Tonight we're going to be starting Chapter 1.2, which focuses on the concept of classification in biology. I'll present this section in two parts. This is Part 1, and I'll assign Part 2 tomorrow night. Alright, let's get started. So, what does it mean to classify things? For example, if I were to ask you to classify the shoes in your wardrobe, what would I be asking you to do? Some of you are able to guess that I would be asking you to look at all of your shoes and then put them into groups based on their characteristics. You might put them into two groups, school shoes and sports shoes, and then you might divide the sports shoes into tennis shoes and cleats, and so on. Well, dealing with all the species in the natural world, biologists have a similar task to perform. When we look at all the living organisms on the planet, we see an almost unimaginable variety of shapes, sizes, characteristics, and features. If we want to study all of these organisms, the most natural way to start is by classifying them, or in other words, organizing them into groups based on their similarities and differences. Now, for biologists, classification is important for more than just keeping everything organized. In fact, classifying organisms actually helps us to understand the relationships that exist between every organism that is on our planet. Let's look, for example, at the species that are shown below. Let's say you're a field biologist and you encounter the species here, which is very unique looking. This is the axolotl, and you encounter the species for the first time in the wild. As a newly discovered species, you'd want to begin to understand how it evolved and what other species it might be closely related to. By carefully observing its various characteristics, you might note some similarities between it and the salamanders and frogs shown to the left and to the right. And based on those similarities, you would be able to classify it as an amphibian. Oops, I'm sorry about that. I thought that would all come up. Okay, so you can finish writing that down and go to the next slide. There's our axolotl, our tree frog, our salamander. All right. So let's start at the beginning with a little history of biological classification. Our modern classification system was established in the 1700s by a Swedish botanist named Carolus Linnaeus. And while there are other systems and scientifically minded folk trying to organize our understanding of the world's species prior to Linnaeus, Linnaeus actually provided the first system of classification that was consistent in its standards of order, yet flexible enough to accommodate new species. In the time since Linnaeus began his work in the 1700s, our system of classification has actually undergone many changes, and it actually continues to be modified today as biologists make new discoveries, even up to the present day. The familiar hierarchy you see to the right, hopefully this is familiar to you. This hierarchy is what came out of Linnaeus's original classification system. Okay, this classification system groups organisms by commonalities, starting at the top into increasingly smaller and more specific groups. We call these groups taxa. Now, hopefully, you know the names and orders of the 8 taxa as a review, and we will go over this in class. The most broad one is actually not shown. It's the domain. And like I said, I'll tell you more about that in class. And then we have the kingdom being underlined there. Then more specifically, the phylum, then class, then order, then family, genus, And then finally down to the most specific taxon, the species. All right. Now that we've reviewed the modern classification system, let's take a look at how organisms get assigned into their various domains, kingdoms, phyla, etc. The act of organizing living things is actually its own mini-branch or type of science, known as taxonomy. So let's define it here. Taxonomy is the practice and science of classification. A scientist whose job it is to classify things is called a taxonomist. And this is also why the different levels or groups that you saw on the last slide that are used for classification are called taxa. So let's imagine ourselves to be taxonomists for a second. If this were your job, then when new species were discovered, you as the taxonomist would have to decide where to classify it and why. If you were a taxonomist, what criteria would you consider before assigning a species to this kingdom or that family or this genus, etc.? Well, there are 4 criteria that you would want to consider if you were a professional taxonomist. The first consideration is the organism's structures and functions. So for instance, does it have 4 limbs? Does it have gills for breathing? Does it give birth to live offspring, or does it incubate and hatch eggs? Is it a producer or a consumer? Organisms are often, but not always, classified with other organisms that have similar structures and similar functions. The second criterion that taxonomists look at is the organism's early stages of development. For example, looking at the adult mouse compared to an adult human, you might not think that they're in any way closely related. However, looking at the developing mouse embryo here, compared to the picture next to it, which is a developing human embryo, and you quickly see that it's very difficult to tell the difference between the mouse and the human. The similarities in early stages of development reveal a closer relationship between these 2 organisms than is initially apparent just by looking at the adult forms. All right, the third criterion is ancestry. In other words, looking at the fossil record and finding similarities between the species you are trying to identify and the species that have existed in the past. A familiar example is how structural evidence from fossils has helped taxonomists classify birds as closely related to dinosaurs. The final criterion that taxonomists consider when classifying an organism is DNA evidence. Now, DNA evidence is the newest criterion, but it has proved incredibly valuable to taxonomists, and today is probably the criterion that's most heavily relied upon for making decisions about classification. We will study DNA in depth this year, but for now you should know that DNA acts as a code and that organisms with lots of similarities in their DNA codes are closely related and therefore classified together. Okay, that's it for today. We will pick up tomorrow night with part 2, which will describe binomial naming and how the relationships between organisms can be depicted using a phylogenetic tree. Don't forget to take the Quizmodo so that I can check your comprehension for this part of the notes, and I'll see you tomorrow.